think everybody naturally assumes that altruism is possible. I think everyone naturally evaluates his own actions, the actions of other people, and recognizes that some of them are altruistic and some of them are not altruistic. And if he thinks that altruism is an important value, he tries to work to become more altruistic. And so he evaluates other people as well, and that's important practically. The person is more altruistic, so then you can trust him and you can count on his cooperation. Now, sometimes we go through revolutions, something that everybody naturally assumes turns out to be wrong. It does happen. But it happens rarely. The vast majority of the things that we all naturally assume are correct are correct. So one has to have a balanced mind. One shouldn't be dogmatic and fanatic about it. Yeah, it could turn out not to be right. But boy, you better show me. You better have some really good reasons to think that it's not so. Some really good reasons to think that we're all vastly mistaken in thinking that altruism is a reality. So what we're going to do is take a look at the way in which people try to attack altruism and show that it is really just a mirage. And I'm going to have a two-stage discussion. Stage one, I'm going to see whether they have good reason to think altruism is impossible. I'm going to put what's called the burden of proof on them. Let them run with the ball. Show me your reasons for thinking that altruism is impossible. And I'm going to attack those reasons. And if I'm successful at the end of stage one, we will know nothing. Because at the end of stage one, I will simply have shown their reasons for thinking it's wrong fail. Okay? It might still be wrong, just their reasons fail. And it might be right. So at the end of stage one, we'll know nothing. Then I'll present you with positive reasons, maybe 8 positive reasons for thinking that altruism is real. Those are the two stages. So now, why would anybody think that altruism isn't real? Why would he think it's all a massive illusion? The best persuasion I know of goes like this. If you know other things, or you've thought about other things in this regard, we should talk about them. It's called the opponent a cynic. The cynic says, you give me your best case of altruism. The one you think is most convincing, I'll show you that it's wrong. And if your best case is wrong, then Afar Torah, as we say in the yeshiva, Kal V'chomer, all the rest of them are wrong. Okay, here's my best case. It's January 3rd in Chicago, and it's sleeting, and the wind chill is minus 44. And George is out driving his car, and poor George's car, the motor just cocks and coasts over to the side of the road. Now this happened 35 years ago. He puts up a white kerchief on his radio antenna, and then somebody stops to help him. Today, everyone just goes by as quickly as possible. They're afraid of being victimized, but there was a time when people stopped. You can read about it in newspapers. So Fred stops and he says, "What's the matter, George?" He says, "I don't know, my car died, I don't know what to do." And Fred says, "Let me take a look. I know something about cars." So they open up the hood, and Fred messes around with it for a little bit, and then he says to George, "Try it now." George puts in the key, turns it, and bang, starts up. George gets in his car and drives away, leaves no identifying information. The sleet has covered George's license plate, so Fred can't even read his license plate and trace him. And George can't trace him. And Fred drives off, and I say to the cynic, that's my case of altruism. I think that Fred did what he did just for the sake of benefiting George. Cynic says, let me ask you a couple of questions. How do you think Fred felt as he drove away? How did he feel? I guess he felt pretty good, He stopped to help somebody. saved somebody some time and effort and money and stress and all the rest. So, the cynic says, that means that Fred felt pleasure, right? Guess so. Now tell me, says the cynic, how would Fred have felt if he had passed George by, just left him freezing there in the cold? So, well, probably would have felt bad about it, felt that he left somebody to suffer and he could have helped him. And, right, says the cynic. It means if he had passed him by without helping him, he'd have felt pain, right? So, yeah. Okay, says the cynic. You see that by stopping and helping George, Fred got himself pleasure and avoided for himself pain. Does that sound altruistic to you? That sound generous to you? He got himself pleasure and avoided pain. No difference between stopping to help somebody on the road and buying yourself an ice cream cone. You get pleasure, avoid pain. It's all completely selfish. All completely egotistical. Altruism is just a mirage, just a mistake. You analyze carefully enough what's going on, you see that it's not altruistic at all. That's the argument. Is it clear what the cynic is saying? The cynic has made a fatal mistake. The cynic has confused consequences of the action with the purpose of the action. They're not the same. The fact that the action produces Q doesn't mean that Q was the purpose of the action. Let me give you an example where you can see the difference. About 10 years ago, the Mississippi River overflowed the whole length of its course down the Midwestern United States. And there were massive efforts to save the towns in its path, and some were saved and some were not. There were massive floods. As the crest moved down, cities below were frantically piling up sandbag walls to hold back the water. Now, Fred lives in Santa Monica and he's watching this on television. He thinks, those poor people, they're going to be wiped out. This is terrible. I can't let that happen. Jumps in his car. He drives for 36 hours straight. He arrives in the Midwest and he goes far enough downstream that the crest is scheduled to get there in 4 days. And he says, where are the gangs hauling up the sandbags? I'm volunteering. I'm volunteering from California. And he gets on the assembly line there and he starts handing up 100-pound sandbags to build the wall. And he does that for 4 days till the crest gets there. Then he goes back to Santa Monica. A couple of months later, he's describing this experience to a friend and saying how good he feels that he at least tried to help people who were in danger, in distress. A friend says to him, Fred, he spent 4 days hauling 100-pound sandbags. Do you think that increased your muscular strength? Your muscles got stronger? So Fred says, yes, so. Well, it's really quite strenuous activity for 4 days. Says the friend, well, that's why you did it. You did it to get a good workout and build your muscles. You didn't have them in mind. It wasn't altruistic. You just did it for your own benefit. I hope we all agree that that's colossally dumb. First of all, Fred didn't think about it till now. Second of all, if he'd want to build his muscles, he could have stayed at home and built his muscles. He wouldn't have to drive to the Midwest to build his muscles. He could work out at the gym in California. The fact that strengthening his muscles was a consequence of his actions, something good for him, that his muscles are stronger. It's a consequence of his actions. It doesn't follow that was his purpose in acting. It just doesn't follow. There's a difference between what happens when I act versus what I'm after, what I'm going for when I act. All the cynic has shown in attacking my Chicago case is that when Fred stopped to help George, he got a pleasure and he avoided a pain. That's true. He got a pleasure and he avoided a pain. But that's not the issue. The issue is not whether he got a pleasure. The issue is whether getting the pleasure was the purpose of his acting. The cynic has said nothing to convince us of that. Said nothing to verify that. So the cynic's argument simply doesn't tell against altruism. Now, this is the end of stage one. We should stop and discuss it. But remember what I think I'm accomplishing here. At the end of stage one, We simply now don't know whether altruism is possible or not. I've just defeated an argument against altruism. I haven't shown that altruism is true or is possible, whatever happens, but the argument the cynic has put forward is not an adequate argument. Are we getting so far?
But isn't the case that you gave, wouldn't that be already a proof that a person could do something for good reasons?
No, because it's still possible that he is doing it for the pleasure. It is possible. I mean, the case of the case there. Yeah, there the strengthening of muscles that certainly wasn't the purpose. Mm-hmm. But the cynic could make the same suggestion about feeling pleasure from helping the people and avoiding the pain of seeing people suffer and not helping them. And that pleasure, he did know he was going to get.
Yeah, he might have just done it just so he could tell the story. He always say something like,
right.
I went down there, like I said, so I could tell the story.
That's right.
So that I could, maybe I'll get it and be on the news.
Right, it could be. But notice, but this suggestion you're making now is extremely weak. It could be. It could, and it could not be. For all we know, for all any argument has been presented, all any evidence has been presented, it could be, and it could not be. It could be that he did it just to help the other people. That could be also. No one said anything to show that that's not possible. So at this point in the discussion, we just don't know. Is altruism possible? Isn't it possible? We don't know. The cynic tried to prove it's impossible. He fails. So now we don't know whether it's possible or impossible. Another way that the cynic puts this, in a way boils down to the same thing, but here it's based on ambiguous language. Isn't it true that everything you do, you ultimately do because you want to do it? I guess so. I mean, even if somebody puts a gun to my head, I do it because I want to stay alive. So, if you're doing it because you want to do it, then it must be that it's selfish. It's only because you want to do it. Now, first of all, that doesn't strictly cut the mustard. Because, as I just said, what's crucial is not that you want to do it. The question is, why do you want to do it? What's your goal in doing it? Of course I do it because I want to do it. But if what I want to do is help the other person, then it becomes altruistic. So just pointing out whatever I do because I want to do it is not going to do it. It's not going to help. Derek Parfit has a wonderful way to show this point by observing that the word want can be used in different ways. Imagine the following scenario. George and Fred are friends, and they've decided to spend Sunday afternoon together. But they have different opinions about what they should do. Fred wants to go mountain climbing, and George wants to play chess. And you can't do both. Now George is musing to himself, okay, I want to play chess. He wants to go mountain climbing. Well, you know, we've been together for a long time, and sometimes he gets into me, and sometimes he gets into him. I guess, all things considered, I'll do it his way. So George calls up Fred, and this is what he says. You know, Fred, I've decided what I really want to do is what you want to do, not what I want to do. You could say that, right? What I really want to do is what you want to do, not what I want to do. Obviously, if he says what I really want to do is not what I want to do, we better do a little work, like, do you or don't you want? But there's two levels of want, or two different types of want. There's want in the sense of, it will give me pleasure. Then there's want in the sense of taking everything into account, my pleasure, your pleasure, health, cost, and everything else. This is the best thing to do, so that's what I vote for. The first want is rooted in my immediate selfish pleasure, and the second want is rooted in, on all things considered, judgment, which takes into account what you want and your pleasure. And once you say that, you see that when you say you only do what you want to do, the you want to do there is the top level. You only do what you decide is what you have planned to do. That's correct. But that takes into account all sorts of things, including the other guy's pleasure, the other guy's benefit. So it doesn't cancel out the idea of altruism. So at this point, I think that altruism is unscathed, but certainly unproved. At this point, we simply don't know whether altruism is possible or not. Okay, what do you got so far? Now, there's a wonderful argument by a British philosopher. His name was Butler, and he's called Bishop Butler because he was a bishop of the Anglican Church. and he wrote a number of important philosophical works. But this argument is really gold. Now, like everything else in scholarship, there are certain disagreements about what his argument really shows. I have a way of presenting it. Someone wrote a chapter in a book against Butler. I read it. I thought, I can't recognize Butler here at all. So maybe I've just been inspired by Butler and some, but it's mine. I don't know. I'm not into history or philosophy. That's not my field. I'm just trying to make arguments that work. So I know I read these ideas in Butler. If somebody says to you, "Oh, that's not what Butler meant," good. I'm taking responsibility for it. Let's think for a few minutes about pleasure. You could divide pleasure into two types, and maybe there are others that I'm not thinking of, but there's certainly a distinction between these two types. Some things are pleasurable just because of the way you're wired. I won't say hardwired, currently wired. Simply, certain things give you pleasure. There are other pleasures which are satisfactions. They give you pleasure because they satisfy desires that you have. You have desires for them that motivates you to go after them. And when those desires are satisfied, when you get them, you get the pleasure of satisfaction. If you didn't have those desires, you wouldn't have any satisfaction from the activity, and you wouldn't get any pleasure from it. So pleasures in the world are divided into three types. There are those that are in the wiring, there are those that are satisfaction of desires, and then some get both. So, for example, when you'll have children, and you'll have the wonderful experience of feeding the child his first taste of ice cream at age 8 months or something. And the child usually is very cautious and hesitant. It's cold, partly solid, partly liquid. Doesn't know what to make of it until he gets the taste. And once he gets the taste, he's hooked for life. That's it. Because that taste gives him instant pleasure. That pleasure has nothing to do with desires. You might desperately desire not to eat ice cream. Somebody said, if you go through the next 24 hours without eating ice cream, I'll give you $1 million. Yes, sir, I'm not touching it. Right? And then they tie you up and they pry open your mouth with reverse pliers. They put the ice cream in. It'll still taste terrific. Even as you're mourning the lost $1 million, it'll still taste terrific. The taste is the taste. Nothing to do with what you want or what you don't want. Then, there are activities which give pleasure only because of the desire. Let's say playing chess, winning at chess. There are cases, not all, but there are some cases where the winning at chess would be pleasurable only if you want to win. If you don't want to win, then winning won't be pleasurable. For example, you've invited your 9-year-old cousin to a game of chess so as to encourage him to play chess. And your plan is to artfully, skillfully lose the game to him. You know, take some of his pieces, make it look like it's a real contest, but then in the end, lose the game gracefully, and when he wins the game, he'll be encouraged to play more chess. But, too bad, he's so clumsy, he makes so many ridiculous moves, and he himself realizes that, oh, why did I move there? That was stupid. That you reluctantly take piece after piece, and you finally win the game. Will you have any pleasure for winning that game? I don't think so, because you didn't want to win the game. Had you wanted to win the game, you'd have had the pleasure of satisfaction. But you didn't want to win it, so there's no pleasure of satisfaction. I have another 8-year-old who's been terrorizing the neighborhood, and you want to take him down a peg, and you play, and you win. It's not hard. You're not proving your brilliance. You're just taking him down a peg. You win, you'll be satisfied. And you'll have a pleasure from it, because you got what you wanted. There are some things which are pleasurable only because you have a desire for it. And then there are things that are both. Go back to the ice cream. The first time the child tastes ice cream, he has a pleasure right away. And that triggers in him a desire to get more ice cream. So the second time he has ice cream, he gets a double pleasure. The pleasure of the immediate taste of the ice cream, plus the satisfaction of getting the ice cream that he wants. Okay, this is pretty pedestrian. Now, Bishop Butler, in my version, asks, let's think about the case where the only available pleasure is the pleasure of satisfying the desire. I'm about to pull out the rug from under your feet. So let me make this vivid and let me, chisel it in stone before I pull out the rug. See, here's this guy and he has a desire. He has a desire for Q, whatever Q is. Now, if you get him Q, if he captures Q, if he acquires Q, then the pleasure will be a result of satisfying the desire for Q. It's an after effect. It's an impact. He wants Q, he gets Q, and when he gets Q, that causes the desire of satisfaction. And that's the only pleasure available in this transaction. Okay? Now here's Bishop Butler's key question. What's Q? Is Q pleasure? Is this a desire for pleasure? Says Butler, it can't be. This desire can't be a desire for pleasure. Because if Q is a pleasure, then you have two pleasures in this scenario, not one. You have Q, which is a pleasure on itself, and secondarily, you also have the pleasure of satisfying the desire. Like the second taste of ice cream. The second taste of ice cream. Where the taste of ice cream is the pleasure, is a pleasure in and of itself, and because you wanted the ice cream and you got the ice cream, you have the satisfaction of the desire to get the ice cream. Then you have two pleasures. But we're talking about a case where the only pleasure available is the pleasure of satisfaction. So there's no room for the first pleasure. So again, poor George has the desire for Q. He's going after Q. He gets Q. When he gets Q, he satisfies his desire for having Q. But that's the only pleasure in the scenario. Then Q can't be a pleasure. Because if Q were a pleasure, there'd be two pleasures, not one. That means this desire for Q is not a desire for pleasure. What this shows is there are some desires that people have whose goal is not pleasure. Now, the next step follows as the day follows the night. If there are desires for pleasure, desires motivate you to act. If you act on that desire, then your action's goal is not pleasure. If you act on a desire for Q, then your action's goal is Q. When you get Q, you got what you went after. And Q is not a pleasure. Yes, there will be a pleasure, but now we're back to Chicago. Sure, there's a pleasure. Pleasure of satisfying the desire for Q. But that's the byproduct. That's the consequence. That wasn't the goal of the activity. What I said in describing Chicago, that it might be just a goal, just a consequence and not the goal. Now you have concrete cases where that's so. Concrete cases where the desire is a desire for a Q, and Q isn't a pleasure, and the pleasure is only a byproduct of satisfying the desire to do what you wanted to do. So this is already a start towards a positive reason that there really is altruism. If there are desires like that, and again, what I said in the name of Derek Parfit, the fact that I'm acting on my desire doesn't clinch it. Sure, I'm acting on my desire. Whose desire should I act on? Yours? I'm acting, so it's got to be something in me that motivates me to act. That's not the issue. The issue is, what is the desire for? It doesn't have to be a desire for my own pleasure. That's part of our psychology. Now, the critic may say, okay, I'll give you that point, but it's very limited, that point. All you've shown is that there are some desires that aren't desires for pleasure, but maybe all of them are desires for means to pleasure, to other pleasures. Sure, Q isn't a pleasure, and you desire Q, and when you go after Q, you're not going after pleasure, not in trying to get Q. And the pleasure you get for satisfying your desire for Q is not the same as Q. But I would ask you, why do you desire to get Q? Where did the desire come from? How did you come to desire Q? Maybe you only desire Q because Q will get you R, and R will get you S, S will get you T, and T is a pleasure. Maybe all the things you desire, which aren't pleasures, are just means at the end of the chain to a pleasure, which means that all you desire ultimately are pleasures. So I agree with you. I won't say anymore that all desires are desires for pleasure, which is what these people used to say. But I'll say they're either desires for pleasure or desires for means for pleasure, and I will say that ultimately you're motivated only by pleasure. The end goal of every motivation is pleasure. Okay, now, first of all, I want you to see how weak that is. He's saying this. Well, you know, it's a free world. You can say anything you like. You can say that the moon is made of green cheese. I mean, I can't stop you. But your saying it doesn't give me a reason for thinking it's true. All you've shown is that it may be possible. Now, I'm trying to give you a reason to think that altruism was real, so all you've shown is that my reason so far doesn't clinch it. So now you've responded to me the way I responded to you. Maybe we're in neutral ground. We still don't know what's correct. But I think the idea that all we desire ultimately is pleasure is really quite questionable. If you think about people's normal psychology, think about people that operate in the world, I think our common experience shows us that this is certainly not correct. Think about asking somebody why he does something and thinking where the chain would end. Sometimes it ends in pleasure. George, you have a well-paying job. Why do you work at that job? To earn money. Why do you want to earn money? Because I want to buy a house. Why do you want to buy a house? Because I want to live in the house. Why do you want to live in the house? Because living in the house is a great pleasure. It's terrific. It's wonderful to live in a house. Why do you want to have great pleasure? Why do you want to feel terrific? At this point, George is going to say, are you nuts? What do you mean, why? Because it'll be a great pleasure. Because it'll feel terrific. That's the end of it. There's nothing more beyond that why I want to do it. It's just the end of this chain of motivation is to end in that pleasure. That's perfectly reasonable. That's perfectly reasonable. But other things are also perfectly reasonable. See George handing $500 to Peter. Say, George, why are you handing $500 to Peter? He says, I'll tell you why. Because I borrowed $500 from Peter. And I'm paying off the debt. I said, well, okay, I hear you, George, but why are you paying off the debt? Why am I paying off the debt? Because I borrowed the money. It's a debt. I owe him the money, so I'm paying it off. Yeah, but why are you paying it off? What are you going to get out of it? What goal are you trying to achieve? Now, it may be, all I need is that it's possible. All I need is this happens sometimes. It may be that George will say, honestly, truly, there isn't any other goal. That's what I do. When I borrow money, I pay it back. That's who I am. That is certainly psychologically real. It might not be the story for some people. It might be in the case of Francis, that yes, why are you paying the debt? Because I want to have good credit. Next time I need to borrow money, people have to know that I pay off my debts. It could be, but it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be. Some people, he pays off a debt because he borrowed the money, he doesn't want to be indebted, he pays off the money because he borrowed it. Fulfilling moral obligations, for some people, sometimes in their psychology, is a stopping place. They do it and they don't do it for any other purpose. Then there's another kind. They say, why are you touring the slums? I say, look, I grew up in an upper middle class background, and economically things were pretty easy. I had pretty much everything that I wanted, and I enjoyed growing up and so on and so on. I would like to increase my sensitivity for people who have less, grow up with less. I'd like to be able to share their pain and their frustration. I'd like to be able to see the world through their eyes. I grew up in a sheltered environment. I have to break that shelter. So I go to the slums from time to time, talk to people, I sit with them, and I try to feel things from their point of view. The guy says, okay, so why are you trying to increase that sensitivity? Now, it could be to get a job. It could be to teach better in psychology classes and so on. It could be. But it also could be the person says, I think sensitivity is important. I think it's important to be a sensitive person. I have a kind of self-image that I would like to build, I'd like to live up to. My own ideal self-image, I see myself as a sensitive person, and I'm not there. So I'm working on fulfilling my self-image for myself. And why are you working on fulfilling your self-image? That's who I am. That's who I am. That's what I want to be. I want to be that kind of person. And that might be the end of the motivation. There might not be anything more than that. And by the way, in the case of pleasure, it also doesn't have to end with, it's a pleasure, so that's why I want it. It doesn't have to. The same flexibility with pleasure. And why are you going after that pleasure? I'll tell you why. Because it lowers my blood pressure. That's why. I don't want to die, and I'm taking care of my health. So getting the pleasure itself might not be an end. Going after pleasure isn't always an end either. It's going to vary from person to person, but there are other goals that in normal psychology can be, not always are, but can be ends of motivation, and two of them are fulfilling moral responsibilities and living up to a certain self-image. So that shows you that even if I proved there's a desire for Q and Q is not a pleasure, and you say, yeah, but Q might be a means to other things. True, it very well might be a means to other things. But when you chase the train of motivations all the way to its end, there's no reason to think that at the end there's only pleasure. Indeed, there's plenty of reason to think that at the end sometimes there isn't pleasure. So that means there are desires for things which aren't desires for pleasure, and they aren't desires for means to pleasure. When you act on those desires, you're acting altruistically. And that seems to be good reason to think that altruism is correct. Are we together so far? Okay, this is very important because not only does it confirm what we said at the beginning, everybody naturally assumes that altruism is true, and the critic had no good, strong, compelling argument to convince us that our natural commitment to altruism is a mistake, and now we have good reason to think that altruism is correct, but the Torah is built on an assumption of altruism. First of all, in serving God, there are different levels of serving God. Serving God selfishly is valid service. It's valid. A person who serves God to get a reward in the world to come and to avoid punishment in the world to come, his service is valid. He gets credit for his mitzvos, and he will earn the reward. It's just considered to be immature, childish. Much higher motivation is to serve God because it's the right thing to do, the appropriate, the best, most valuable thing to do, and ultimately to serve God out of love for God. Not love for oneself, but love for God. That's what all the books say, although some dispute whether there's another additional, perhaps higher element or something else, but everyone preaches that serving God out of love is a goal of service of God. Now, if altruism were impossible, that goal would just be an illusion. It would be something it would be impossible to fulfill. If everybody always did everything only for his own sake, then it would be an impossibility. But if the Torah prescribes it, it certainly is possible. We just have to see why, as we have seen, that the philosophical arguments don't make trouble for this. Now, two remarks of more detailed sort. How far can you go with this? So altruism is important, and one should work and build to become altruistic. How does one do this, and what limits are there to it? I'm going to tell you something which I believe. I have a very strong intuition about it. I don't have a tight argument for it. You look at a person's psychology and you talk about changing it, strengthening these aspects, weakening those aspects. How far can you go? How much innovation can you make for a person's psychology? I'm convinced that if a whole category of feeling isn't there, there's nothing normal that you can do to bring it out. The Torah tells us that we are all born with altruism programmed in. Not only altruism, selfishness is there also, and all sorts of other things. But some altruism is programmed in. Indeed, since God's motivation in creating the universe is only altruistic, it's only to give good, only to benefit, the very fact that we're made in God's form means that some altruism is programmed into the human being. So the human being starts off with some altruism and some selfishness, and then he can be told, act in such a way as to increase the altruism, reduce the selfishness. If he were born without any altruism altogether, I think it would be impossible to develop it out of nothing. I'll just give you an analogy which may make this vivid. There's a terrible, terrible condition called being a psychopath. Psychopathy. A psychopath is a person who says something like this. Let's say I have this knife, I have to put it down. I want to put it down in a place where it'll stay, where it'll be stuck in. I have two options. I could stick it to the table, or I could stick it into Peter's arm. Now, my experience has told me that when you stick it in a person's arm, he bleeds and he yells. And that's not pleasant. On the other hand, sticking it in the table is going to make a dent in the table. That's not nice either. So, I think I'll stick it into Peter's arm. A psychopath can't feel other people's pain. He can't feel it. He hears the yelling and screaming. He sees them fainting. He sees the bleeding. But pain isn't associated with that. It's just stuff going on. That's why he can do horrible things to other people without thinking twice. Because he doesn't think he's causing them pain. And he doesn't think, it's not as if, oh, are they feeling pain? No, I don't think this one. Others' pain is a non-category. It's like a person's colorblind. Tell him, concentrate on the blue. There's nothing there. Now I say, okay, what shall we do for him to enable him to feel other people's pain? I don't know. Rewire his brain? I mean, I don't know. I can't think of any, take him to the South Seas, scuba diving. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? He's missing the whole category. If someone were missing the category of altruism, there'd be no way to create it in him out of nothing. That's why it's very important that God created us with a natural tendency to altruism. Just we have other contradictory tendencies. That's what enables us to have free will. Now, you can then strengthen your altruism in various ways. First of all, you ask yourself, what already triggers in me an altruistic response? Let's say, seeing people desperate. So people are desperate, I think, that's horrible. I've got to do something for them. How can I increase my altruism? Realize that other people are also desperate. You may not realize it. They may be hiding it, but the truth is, other people are also desperate, so they also need your help. I come to see them through new eyes. There are people, I don't know how they get to this crazy position, but I think that addicts are just bums, and they don't exercise will, and they're lazy, and so on and so on. Such a person, I would say, let's read some books about altruism, about addiction. Let's see some films about addiction. Let's go to places where addicts suffer and where they try to rehabilitate and talk to them. When you see that they're desperate, your altruism will spread to cover them also. You're taking his already given plank of altruism for desperate people. You're expanding the category of desperate people, and that way you're expanding his altruism. That's one way to do it. You can certainly increase your altruism once you have the basis there. Now, how far can this go? Would it be conceivable that a human being should be wholly altruistic? 100% altruistic? All he cares about, all his desires are desires for other people, and therefore all his actions will be actions for the sake of other people? Shimon Shkop wrote one of the classics of Talmudic analysis, legal philosophical arguments, various Talmudic passages. In the introduction, this is an interesting thing about our literature. The introduction to a book may have absolutely nothing to do with the book. Nothing at all. These scholars who wrote these legal and philosophical tracts, in the introductions talked about Kabbalistic matters and value matters. This is quite... why they did it, how the literature arose, I don't know. But in his introduction, which isn't too long, he deals with a number of interesting philosophical issues, and this is one of them. The sefer is called Shara Yosher. And there he says, 100% altruism is impossible for a human being. Impossible. Why is that? Well, he starts with a midrash, very famous midrash. God says to the Jewish people, be holy. Kedoshim tihiyu. We read it a couple of weeks ago. For I'm holy. And then the midrash goes on, Yachol kamoni. You think that you could be holy the way I'm holy? Tamalomar kikar Hashem. The pasuk says that God is holy, I'm holy, and you can't be holy like me. That's what the midrash says. Says Shimon, let's think about this. The Midrash is saying, be holy, and then it says, you might make a mistake. You might think that you could be holy like God is holy. Don't think that. That's dead wrong. Ask Shimon, who would think that? Who would dream that? Who is the Midrash presuming to instruct to prevent his mistake? If holiness means being disconnected from the physical, if holiness means not getting into bad desires and so on, would anyone dream that he could make it to the level of God? Who would dream that? I'm embodied in a body. The body has all sorts of desires that constantly have to be controlled. I'm always in the possibility of making bad decisions and doing bad things. So what false idea, plausible false idea, is the Midrash coming to correct? Says Rav Shimon, I suggest that you read the word Kedoshim, holy, as altruistic. Read it as meaning acting altruistically. Now, says Rav Shimon, the Havamina, the plausible false idea that the Midrash wants to exclude is, I want you to be altruistic like I'm altruistic. God created the world only for the sake of helping us, building us, benefiting us. I want you to be altruistic also. Yochel Kamoni, do you think you could be altruistic like I am? And I think, I don't know. Why not? Part of me is already naturally altruistic. You created me that way. Now I have selfish sides. I can work on it. I can spread my altruism. I can weaken the selfish side. Maybe I can weaken the selfish side to zero. Who says no? I thought you would think that, says the Midrash. No, impossible. Not possible. So that's, if you can read the word Kedoshim as altruistic, then the logic of the Midrash now makes plausible sense. Says Rav Shimon, but how do we know it's right? What makes the Midrash right? And he cites another teaching which he uses in a very creative way. Our world, according to one teaching, is a world in which we earn what we get in the world to come. We earn it because if we didn't earn it, we'd be embarrassed by it. You give somebody a free gift, you're treating him as an incompetent. You're treating him as an infant. You're treating him as a dependent. Nobody wants to be treated that way. Anybody will want an exciting, pleasurable, fun-filled job better than welfare. Because he's going to have fun on the job anyway. At least when he gets the money, he's not a pauper. He's not a beggar. Everybody wants to earn it. So God says, I don't want to put you in an ideal world where you get a lot of good but you didn't earn. That won't be a perfect gift. So there's a prelude where you earn it and then you get it. Okay, says Rav Shimon, think of how this pictures the person in the world to come. The picture is he gets to the world to come and he receives all this good stuff and he measures it against his performance and asks, did I earn it or didn't I earn it? Did I deserve it or didn't I deserve it? Or is it a free handout? Says Rav Shimon, that picture means he still cares about himself. He cares about his status. He cares about his dignity. He cares about his success. That slab of him is not altruistic. That slab of him is self-concerned with his own success and benefit. Shimon says, if that's the way you're pictured in the world to come, you're not going to outgrow that here. You're not going to outgrow that here. I've said this many times in many years, but I think I'm thinking over the vocabulary I used to use. I may have made a mistake. I think I'm saying it better now. The fact that when you go to the world to come, you will care about your status there, and particularly your success, means that in this life you're not going to outgrow that altruistic part, that selfish part of yourself. You can't reduce it to zero. What I'm benefiting now, what I'm profiting now, the way I'm putting it now is, all I'm talking about is when you go to the world to come. There are sources that the world to come is not static. And there may be a time in the world to come where you don't care anymore. There may be a time in the world to come where self-regard does evaporate. But that's later in the world to come. You're not going to make any progress in this world beyond what you have at your entry to the world to come. At the entry to the world to come, you definitely care about yourself. You care about your own success. You care about your own status. Then you're not going to outgrow your self-concern, your self-regard totally in this world. That's how he proves that it's not possible to outgrow it. So the best we can hope for is creating a bigger edge. Gradually creating a bigger and bigger edge. But to get to the point where self-regarding motivation is zero, that's not something that we can look forward to. Because we all have this element of regard for the other, we definitely can act for the sake of other people, and we shouldn't let the cynic or the inner cynic deprive us of that realization. Now, I want to go back, just rehearse the idea that I told you with a parable, which is found in some of the ethics books. I think it's only a parable. I don't think it really happened, but it illustrates the point well. And ask yourself, as I develop the parable, whether you get sucked into the false mental set. If you do, then the parable is quite useful for you, and it'll be useful for other people as well. Supposedly, Abraham Lincoln and a friend were riding together in a wagon. And Abraham Lincoln was taking the position of the cynic. Everything you do only for your own benefit, your own pleasure. You never do anything for anybody else. And his friend is debating with him. They come to a bridge over a short bridge over a river. At the edge of the river, there's a bog. And in the bog, there are some baby pigs who are caught in the mud, and they're squealing. So Lincoln tells the wagon driver to stop. He gets out, and he wades out into the bog, and he frees the squealing pigs. Puts them on solid land, comes back into the wagon, they drive off. Lincoln's friend looks at him astonished and says, "Abe, I don't get it. You were just taking the point of view of the cynic. You were saying everything that you do only for the sake of your own pleasure. You stopped the wagon, you're filthy from the knees down, you waded out into the mud to help some squealing pigs. Surely that wasn't selfish. Surely you didn't do that for your own pleasure. Obviously you cared about those squealing pigs." Lincoln says, "No, not at all. You know how I feel right now? I feel great. I feel great. Because I helped those pigs, I have a great deal of pleasure because I helped them. And if I had not helped them, I wouldn't have been able to sleep tonight. I'd have heard the squealing in my memory, and I felt like a cad, like a worm, and someone who had no sympathy for it. So I did it only to gain my own pleasure and to avoid my own pain. It's just another case of my completely selfish behavior." But according to what we've been saying, Lincoln is wrong. Why exactly is he wrong? See, here's what the friend should say back to Lincoln. "Listen, Abe, that's you. You would feel bad if you rode by without helping them. You feel good now that you helped them. But consider me, Abe. I could see them squealing, hear them squealing. I could drive by without a glance, without a thought, and I would not have any pain whatsoever. I don't care whether baby pigs live or die, and squeal or don't squeal, and have pain or don't have pain. And if someone had put a gun to my head and said, 'Free the pigs or I shoot you,' I would have freed the pigs with no pleasure at all. No pleasure at all." So, Abe, what's the difference between you and me? The difference between you and me is that you want to help creatures in pain, and I don't. Now, Abe, when you got pleasure for helping those pigs, it's because it satisfied your desire to help. That's why you got pleasure. Had you passed them by, you would have felt terrible because you've been frustrating your desire to help. The starting point in your motivation is the desire to help. And the desire to help isn't a desire for pleasure, it's a desire to help. And the pleasure you felt afterwards was the satisfaction that you had because you satisfied that desire. Nothing in your behavior confirms the idea that my goal in acting is pleasure. All you've illustrated is that when I act and act successfully, I get pleasure. But the pleasure I get can very well be a byproduct, just a consequence of how I act. It doesn't have to be the purpose of my action. This is the mistake that Lincoln's making. It's a mistake that's made across the board. Some pleasures start with desires. This was Butler's wonderful insight. Some pleasures are only pleasures of satisfying desires, and they are the key to seeing that some of my motivation is not motivation for my own pleasure, for my own benefit. My motivation is very varied. It's for myself, for others. It's for my benefit and your benefit, sometimes for my benefit and other people's destruction. Sometimes it's self-destructive. Motivation is very varied. And there's no reason to reduce it and to put it all into one tiny category, tie it up with one ribbon. Human motivation is very varied. One strand of it is altruistic, and that's how you can build more altruism.